Hello and welcome, dear friends. There is something about Christmas in an English village that makes even the most ordinary house feel as though it is holding its breath, waiting for a secret to be told. Tonight, I invite you into just such a house. Warm firelight, the smell of pine and roasted chestnuts, and a gathering of old friends who believe they know one another very well indeed. But this Christmas, a stranger will walk through the door, charming, familiar, and, as it turns out, entirely too perfect to be true. Only one guest at Ashworth Grange will notice the small things that do not quite fit. An elderly lady with knitting needles and a memory for village gossip, who has seen more of human nature than anyone gives her credit for. If you enjoy a quiet, old-fashioned mystery, the kind meant to be read slowly, by firelight, with a cup of tea close at hand, do stay a while, and perhaps let us know you're here. Now then, let us begin. The guest who came before snow. The fire in the drawing room at Ashworth Grange had been burning since 4 o'clock, and by 6:30 it had settled into that deep, contented glow that only a well-tended Christmas fire can achieve. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall over the low hills beyond the village, softening the hedgerows and dusting the gravel drive in white. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wing chair a little apart from the others, thought it looked exactly like the picture on a Christmas card, which was, she reflected, rather the trouble with it. Real life so rarely looked as tidy as its pictures. She had come to Ashworth Grange at the invitation of her old friend, Dorothy Ashworth, whom she had known since they were girls together at Miss Prentice's Academy for Young Ladies, a very long time ago now. Dorothy had married well, Colonel Gerald Ashworth, a stout, red-faced man with a booming laugh and a genuine fondness for his wife that had not dimmed in 30 years of marriage, and the two of them had settled into the comfortable, unhurried rhythm of country life that Miss Marple understood so well. "You will find us very quiet this year, Jane," Dorothy had written in her looping hand. "Only family, and Christmas is not the same since poor Edward died. But do come. It will do us both good to have someone sensible in the house." Miss Marple was not entirely certain she agreed with the description of the gathering as quiet family, for the drawing room this evening held no fewer than 7 people, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses suggested nothing quiet about it at all. There was Dorothy herself, presiding over the tea things with the particular graciousness of a woman who has spent decades being an excellent hostess. There was the Colonel, holding forth to anyone who would listen about the state of the roads. There was their daughter, Margaret, a thin, anxious woman of perhaps 40, unmarried, who fussed continually over the arrangement of the holly on the mantelpiece, as though her life depended upon its symmetry. There was Margaret's younger cousin, Peter Ashworth, a solicitor's clerk with a quick tongue and quicker opinions, who had driven up from London that afternoon in a little car that had, by his own admission, very nearly not survived the journey. There was old Miss Prynne, a spinster lady of the parish who had known the family for generations, and who Miss Marple suspected knew rather more about everyone's business than she ever let on. And there was the vicar, Mr. Hartley, a mild young man new to the parish, invited more out of Christian duty than genuine intimacy. And then there was the newcomer. He had arrived only an hour before Miss Marple herself, and the house was still faintly abuzz with the surprise of it. His name, he said, was Charles Ashworth, and he claimed, with a warmth that seemed entirely genuine, to be the son of Gerald Ashworth's long-estranged younger brother, Thomas, who had quarrelled with the family some 25 years ago and gone off to make his fortune in South Africa. Thomas, it was generally believed, had died some years back, and nothing had been heard of any children. And yet here was Charles, tall, sun-browned despite the English winter, with an easy laugh and beautiful manners, standing by the fire with a glass of sherry in his hand, as though he had always belonged there. "It is extraordinary," Dorothy said to Miss Marple, drawing her chair a little closer under cover of pouring more tea. Simply extraordinary, Jane. He wrote to Gerald only a fortnight ago. Such a charming letter, all about his father, and little details that no impostor could possibly have known. Gerald wept when he read it. Actually wept. Did he indeed? Said Miss Marple, in the mild tone she generally reserved for matters of great interest. And he is so like Thomas, everyone says so. The same laugh, the same way of standing with his hands in his pockets. Miss Marple looked across the room to where the young man stood, laughing at something Peter had said, his head thrown back in easy amusement, and thought privately that a laugh could be learned and a manner of standing copied by anyone clever enough to wish to copy it. But she said nothing of this, only murmured that it was indeed a wonderful thing for a family to be reunited at Christmas, of all times. Miss Marple, isn't it? The newcomer had detached himself from the group by the fire and come to stand before her, his smile warm and his hand extended. Aunt Dorothy has told me all about you, the famous Miss Marple of St. Mary Mead. I hardly think I am famous, Mr. Ashworth, said Miss Marple, taking the offered hand, though it is very kind of you to say so. Please, call me Charles. We are practically family now, are we not, since you are so dear to Aunt Dorothy. He settled himself into the chair beside hers with the easy confidence of a man entirely comfortable in his surroundings, though he had been in the house scarcely an hour. I must say, it is strange to be here at last. My father spoke of Ashworth Grange so often, though he never came back, of course. Too proud, I think. He always regretted the quarrel. How very sad, said Miss Marple. And your mother, is she still living? She died when I was quite young, I'm afraid, in Durban. A shadow passed over his handsome face, there and gone again. It was my father who raised me, mostly. He talked of England constantly, of this house, of the orchard, of skating on the lake in winter when he was a boy. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. How curious, she said pleasantly, for there has never been a lake at Ashworth Grange. Only the ornamental pond by the rose garden, which I believe is far too shallow for skating, even in the hardest winter. For the smallest fraction of a second, so brief that Miss Marple could not have sworn to it in a court of law, something flickered behind Charles Ashworth's eyes. Then he laughed, easily, charmingly. Ah, well, my father's memory, you know. He had been gone from England so long. I dare say he confused it with somewhere else. Or perhaps I have simply misremembered his stories myself. He smiled again, that same warm, disarming smile. One does, over the years. Yes, said Miss Marple, returning to her knitting with an expression of perfect placidity. One does. But her needles, for the rest of the evening, moved a little more slowly than usual, as they always did when she was thinking very hard indeed. A conversation by candlelight dinner. That evening was a splendid affair, as Christmas Eve dinners at Ashworth Grange had always been. A goose, a ham, roast potatoes glistening with fat, and a Christmas pudding that Dorothy had been feeding Brandy for a full month in preparation. The long table was lit by candles rather than the electric lamps the Colonel had reluctantly installed some years before, for Dorothy held firmly to the belief that candlelight was the only proper illumination for a Christmas table, whatever the modern conveniences might offer. Miss Marple found herself seated between the vicar, Mr. Hartley, and Miss Prynne, which suited her very well, for Miss Prynne was a woman who noticed things, not always the right things perhaps, but things nonetheless, and was not above sharing her observations with anyone who cared to listen. He is very charming, is he not? Miss Prynne murmured, under cover of the general chatter, with a nod toward Charles Ashworth, who sat near the head of the table beside the Colonel, deep in animated conversation about African diamond mines. Almost too charming, if you ask me. My dear mother always said a man who is that agreeable at first meeting is generally hiding something at second. Your mother sounds as though she was a very wise woman, said Miss Marple. Oh, she was. Though of course, Miss Prynne added, lowering her voice further still, the Colonel is utterly convinced. He has taken to him like a son already. You can see it in his face. And who can blame him, poor man, with no son of his own, and Margaret unmarried and likely to remain so? Miss Marple glanced down the table to where Margaret Ashworth sat, pushing a potato about her plate with the fork rather than eating it, her eyes fixed upon her father and the newcomer with an expression that was difficult to name. Not quite resentment, not quite fear, something more complicated than either. Miss Margaret does not seem entirely at ease this evening, Miss Marple observed. Margaret is never entirely at ease, said Miss Prynne, a touch unkindly. She has been fussing over this house since her mother's health began to fail, poor thing, and I dare say she does not relish the notion of a long-lost cousin arriving to— Well, one does hear talk, Miss Marple, though I am sure I do not listen to gossip myself. Of course not, said Miss Marple gravely. But it is said that Gerald means to alter his will. Now that Charles has appeared, you understand. There was some difficulty, some years ago, about the estate passing entirely to Margaret, since there was no son. The Colonel was never quite happy with the notion, being an old-fashioned sort of man about these things. And now, of course, with a nephew turned up who is, after all, Thomas's boy. I see, said Miss Marple, and applied herself to her goose with an air of complete unconcern, though her mind was working a great deal harder than her expression suggested. After dinner, the company retired to the drawing-room once more, where Peter Ashworth insisted upon a game of charades, at which Charles proved himself unexpectedly and delightfully skilled, to the great amusement of everyone but Margaret, who withdrew early with a headache, and the Colonel, who fell asleep in his chair by 9:30 and had to be gently woken by his wife. It was past 10 o'clock, and the rest of the party had drifted toward bed, when Miss Marple, who had excused herself some minutes before on the pretext of fetching a shawl from her room, came upon Charles Ashworth alone in the small library, standing before the case of family photographs that lined one wall, a candle in his hand. He did not hear her enter at first, and for a moment Miss Marple observed him unnoticed, the way he studied each photograph with a peculiar, searching intensity, quite unlike the fond, easy glance of a man looking at pictures of relations he had grown up hearing about. It was, she thought, more the look of a man committing something to memory. "Good evening again, Mr. Ashworth," she said. He turned quickly, a shade too quickly perhaps, and then smiled his easy smile. "Miss Marple, I confess you have caught me being sentimental. I was looking at photographs of my father as a young man. There, that one, with the cricket bat. Aunt Dorothy tells me it was taken the summer before he left for Africa." Miss Marple came to stand beside him and regarded the photograph with interest. It showed two young men in cricket whites upon the lawn at Ashworth Grange, arms about each other's shoulders, laughing at something beyond the edge of the picture. "That is not your father, Mr. Ashworth," she said pleasantly. "That is Gerald's cousin Willoughby, who died at the Somme. Thomas is in the photograph beside it. There, the taller of the two boys by the tennis net." There was a pause, brief, but noticeable, like a missed beat in a piece of music. "Of course," Charles said smoothly, recovering himself at once. "Forgive me. I have never actually seen these photographs before tonight, you understand, and father spoke of so many cousins and relations that I confess I have muddled them rather dreadfully in my head. It is difficult, forming a picture of a family one has never met." "Very difficult indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I should have thought your father would have described his own likeness to you a good many times, if only so that you might know him from photographs, should any come your way." "He was not a man given to describing himself," Charles said, with a small, rueful laugh. "Modest, my father. He would talk for an hour about the house, the gardens, his brother Gerald, but ask him to describe his own face, and he would change the subject entirely." It was, Miss Marple reflected, a very neat answer, perhaps a little too neat, delivered a little too readily, like an excuse that had been prepared well in advance of being needed. But she only smiled and said that modesty was a rare and admirable quality in a man, and bade him good night, and went up to her room with her candle, where she sat for some time before the fire, not sleeping, her needles still, thinking a great many thoughts that she did not, as yet, share with anyone at all. There was, she felt certain, something not quite right about the charming Mr. Charles Ashworth. What that something was, she could not yet say. But she had learned, over a long life in St. Mary Mead, that when a person's manner did not quite match their story, when the small details slipped, however smoothly they were caught and mended, it generally meant that the story itself had been built, rather than lived, and built things, however skillfully constructed, always had their joints. The giving of gifts. Christmas morning at Ashworth Grange broke clear and bright, the snow that had fallen overnight lying thick and unbroken across the lawns, so that the whole world beyond the windows seemed washed clean and new. Miss Marple, who had slept rather less than she generally liked to admit, came down to breakfast to find the household already astir, the children of the village choir having come to sing carols beneath the windows at some unreasonable hour of the morning, much to the Colonel's gruff but secretly delighted annoyance. "Nothing like it," he declared over his kippers. "Nothing like a bit of good, honest carolling to set a man up for Christmas Day. Eh, Charles? They'd not have had carolers where you were, I don't suppose. Too hot for it." "We had our own traditions," Charles said easily, "though I confess I've always wanted to spend a proper English Christmas. Snow and all. It's rather wonderful, actually, like stepping into one of my father's stories." Miss Marple, buttering her toast with great precision, noted that Margaret said nothing at all throughout this exchange, but continued to eat her breakfast, with her eyes fixed firmly upon her plate. The gift-giving was to take place after church, as was the family custom, and by 11:30 the drawing-room had been transformed into a scene of cheerful chaos, brown paper and ribbons scattered across the carpet, the Colonel roaring with laughter over a pair of comic braces from Peter, Dorothy dabbing at her eyes over a length of fine lace that had belonged to her own mother and which Margaret had made up into a collar for her. Charles had brought gifts for everyone, thoughtful, well-chosen gifts, Miss Marple noted, which was in itself rather curious, for a man who had supposedly arrived in England only a fortnight before and can have had little opportunity to learn the tastes of relations he had never met. For the Colonel, a fine leather cigar case. For Dorothy, a small brooch in the shape of a spray of holly, quite tasteful and clearly not inexpensive. For Margaret, a book of poetry that Miss Marple observed her receive with a stiff, unreadable little smile and set aside almost immediately, unopened past the first page. "However did you know Margaret was fond of poetry?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly, when the opportunity arose. "You have been in England such a short time." "Aunt Dorothy mentioned it in one of her letters," Charles said, without hesitation. "She has been very good about keeping me informed of everyone's little tastes and interests, in preparation for my visit." It was, Miss Marple reflected, exactly the sort of answer that closed a door rather than opened one, smooth, plausible, and quite impossible to disprove without writing to Dorothy's correspondence file, which nobody was likely to do. She found herself, not for the first time, admiring the sheer competence of the performance, even as she distrusted it entirely. For Miss Marple herself, Charles had brought nothing, which she thought showed rather good sense on his part, since he could not have known she would be present, and she said as much to him with a smile that made him laugh outright. "You are very direct, Miss Marple. I find it saves a great deal of time, Mr. Ashworth, at my age." It was in the quiet hour after luncheon, when most of the household had drifted off to nap or read by the fire, that Miss Marple came upon Margaret alone in the small morning room, standing at the window with her arms wrapped about herself, looking out at the snow with an expression of such naked unhappiness that Miss Marple, who made a point of never intruding where she was not wanted, nonetheless found herself unable to simply pass by. "You are not enjoying your Christmas, my dear," she said gently, taking a seat near the fire, not too close to the window, so that Margaret might feel free to remain where she was, or come away, as she chose. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then, rather suddenly, she said, "Do you think he is genuine, Miss Marple?" "Charles, I mean. Everyone else seems so certain." What do you think, my dear? You are, after all, more closely concerned than any of us. I think, Margaret stopped, twisting her hands together. I think I do not want to be the sort of woman who resents a cousin's return simply because it is inconvenient for her. That is a very ugly thing to be, and I have tried very hard these 2 weeks not to be it. But there is something, she broke off again, shaking her head. It is absurd. I have no reason at all. Father is so happy, mother is so happy, and I sit here feeling as though something is wrong, and I cannot say what, and I hate myself for it. It is not absurd at all, said Miss Marple, to trust one's own feelings, even when one cannot yet give them a name. I have found, in my own experience, that a feeling of wrongness very often arrives well before the reason for it. The reason generally does catch up, in time, though it is not always convenient when it does. Margaret turned from the window at last and looked at her properly. You feel it too. I can see that you do. Miss Marple, who made a general habit of not answering questions quite so directly, said only, I feel, my dear, that your cousin Charles is a very charming young man who tells a very good story. Whether it is also a true one is a separate question, and one I do not think we should decide in haste, on Christmas Day, with nothing but feelings to go upon. Feelings are an excellent beginning. They make a very poor conclusion. Then you do think there's something wrong? I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that your cousin has already made 2 small errors, of the sort that a man does not make about his own father's history, if the history is truly his own. I do not say this to alarm you, Margaret, but only because I think you have earned the right to know you are not imagining things. We must simply be patient and watchful, and above all, we must say nothing to anyone until we are a good deal more certain than we are now. A false accusation can do a very great deal of harm, sometimes almost as much harm as a true crime left undiscovered. Margaret nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, though not all of it. Father would never forgive me if I accused Charles wrongly. He has wanted a son so badly all these years. I think he would forgive me almost anything except that. Then we shall be very careful indeed, said Miss Marple, to be right before we are certain. It was a conversation that neither of them mentioned again that day, and yet Miss Marple noticed, over the remainder of the afternoon, that Margaret watched her new-found cousin with a more careful eye than before, and that Charles, for his part, seemed once or twice to feel the weight of that watching, and to meet it with a smile that did not, quite, reach as far as his eyes. That evening, as the family gathered once more for a light supper before the fire, Colonel Ashworth rose rather unsteadily to his feet, a glass of port in his hand, his face flushed with warmth and good feeling, and rather more of the port than was, perhaps, entirely wise. I should like, he announced, to general surprise, to say a few words. It is not every Christmas a man gets back what he thought he'd lost for good. I lost my brother to a foolish quarrel 25 years ago, and I have regretted it every Christmas since. Now I've got his son sitting at my table, and I don't mind telling you all, I mean to see he's properly provided for. I've spoken to Petford already about amending the will, and it'll be done before the new year. To Charles! To Charles! The company murmured, glasses raised, and if Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her own glass, only Miss Marple appeared to notice it at all. Only Miss Marple, and perhaps, though it was gone again almost before it could be read, a small, private flicker of satisfaction that crossed Charles Ashworth's handsome face and was smoothed away into gratitude and modest protest before anyone else could see it for what it was. The matter of the signet ring. It was on Boxing Day that the incident occurred, which was, in Miss Marple's private estimation, to prove the most telling of all, though at the time it seemed a very small thing indeed, the sort of trifle that might easily have passed unnoticed by anyone less accustomed to noticing trifles. The morning had dawned grey and still, the snow of the day before now crusted hard with frost, and the household had gone out in a body to walk to the village and back, as was the family custom, calling upon various elderly parishioners along the way with baskets of Christmas fare. Miss Marple, who found the cold rather trying on her joints, had elected to remain behind with a rug over her knees and her knitting, and it was thus that she came to be alone in the drawing-room when Charles Ashworth returned some 20 minutes ahead of the others, complaining of a blister raised by unfamiliar English boots. "I shall be poor company for the rest of the walk, I'm afraid," he said, settling into the chair opposite hers with a rueful laugh. "So I have abandoned the others to their charitable errands and come back to nurse my wounds by the fire. You do not mind the company, Miss Marple?" "Not in the least, Mr. Ashworth. I find I enjoy a quiet fire and quiet conversation a great deal more than a walk in the frost, at my age." They talked for some time of unimportant things: the excellence of Dorothy's Christmas pudding, the peculiarities of English weather, which Charles professed to find both dreadful and delightful in equal measure, and Miss Marple, watching him across her knitting with her mild, unassuming gaze, thought that whatever else he was certainly a most agreeable companion, and she could quite understand how the Colonel had been won over so completely and so quickly. It was as he reached across to take a cup of tea that she noticed, at last, the ring upon his right hand, a heavy gold signet, rather old-fashioned, engraved with a crest she recognized at once, having seen its twin 100 times upon the Colonel's own hand, and, in earlier years, in photographs of the Colonel's late father. "What a fine old ring, Mr. Ashworth," she observed. "The Ashworth crest, is it not? I did not know your branch of the family had kept one." Something in his expression shifted, so slightly that a less practiced observer might have missed it entirely, before he answered, with his usual easy smile, "It was my father's. He wore it always, and left it to me when he died. I confess I am rather proud of it. It is one of the few things I have of his." "How very touching," said Miss Marple, "that he should have kept it all those years, in Africa, so far from the family he had quarrelled with." "Sentiment, I suppose," Charles said. "A man may quarrel with his brother, and still love the house he grew up in." Miss Marple said nothing further on the subject, but that evening, on the pretext of admiring an old photograph album that Dorothy kept in the library, she made a point of examining, with great care, a photograph taken some 30 years before of the two Ashworth brothers as young men, Gerald and Thomas together upon the terrace, both dressed for some occasion of family importance. Both young men, in the photograph, wore upon their right hands a ring of exactly the kind Charles now wore. For it had been, Dorothy explained when asked, a family custom for many generations, that each son of the house receive such a ring upon his coming of age, made new for the occasion by the same jeweller in Bath who had served the family for 3 generations. "Thomas had his made just as Gerald did," Dorothy said, "though of course I never saw it after he left. He took it with him to Africa, I always understood, though we heard so little from him in later years." It was, on the surface, a small confirmation rather than a contradiction, and yet it troubled Miss Marple a great deal, for a reason she did not immediately share, even with herself. She sat with her knitting that night longer than usual, turning the matter over, until at last the shape of her unease became clear to her, and she nodded slowly to herself, in the manner of a woman who has at last located a dropped stitch some rows back in her work. The ring Charles wore was old. That much was certainly true. It had the soft, worn quality that only real age could give to gold. But it was, she felt nearly certain, not old in the particular way it ought to have been. A ring made for a boy of 21, worn constantly for 25 years thereafter by a working man in a hot climate, ought to show the particular wear of that history, a certain thinning at the band, a softening of the engraved lines from daily contact with rope and tool and sun-browned skin. The ring on Charles's finger showed the wear of age, certainly, but a different history of age altogether. The deeper, more evenly distributed wear of a ring, passed from hand to hand, kept in drawers, worn only occasionally, by more than one owner, over a longer span of years than 25. It was the sort of observation that Miss Marple could not have explained satisfactorily to a court of law, or even, perhaps, entirely to herself in words, and yet she had spent a very great many years observing the small physical evidences of age and use in the ordinary objects of ordinary lives, in a village where every teapot and hat and pair of gloves told its own small history to anyone patient enough to read it. And she did not believe that ring had spent 25 years upon the hand of a single man in Africa. She did not, however, share this observation with anyone that evening, not even with Margaret, who caught her eye once across the drawing-room with a question plainly written on her face, and received in answer only a small, private shake of the head that meant, "Not yet." For Miss Marple had learned, over a long life, that suspicion voiced too early served only to warn the guilty and alarm the innocent, and that the only useful thing to do with a half-formed certainty was to wait and watch and gather just a little more, until the moment came when speaking would do some good, rather than simply satisfying the speaker's own impatience. That moment she felt with a small, cold certainty, quite unlike her usual placid cheerfulness, was coming a good deal sooner than any of them expected. She was not to know, as she sat by the dying fire that Boxing Day night, with her knitting forgotten in her lap, quite how soon, nor quite how much worse the matter was to prove than a mere question of inheritance and a borrowed name. A sudden illness. The 27th of December began, like the days before it, with a clear, cold sky and the household settling into the comfortable, slightly aimless rhythm of the days between Christmas and the New Year. It was to end very differently. Colonel Ashworth had risen early, as was his habit, and gone down to his study before breakfast to deal with correspondence, a task he generally found tedious, but which he had undertaken with unusual good cheer that morning, for it was his intention, he had told Dorothy the night before, to write to old Petford the solicitor and set in motion the formal amendment of his will, that Charles might be properly and legally provided for before the family dispersed again after the New Year. He did not appear at breakfast. This was not, in itself, remarkable. The Colonel was known to lose track of time entirely when absorbed in his correspondence, but when Dorothy went to fetch him at 9:30, she found him slumped forward over his desk, his face grey, his breathing shallow and laboured, a half-written letter beneath his hand. The house was thrown at once into confusion. Peter was dispatched in his little car to fetch Dr. Fenwick from the village, a journey made hazardous by the icy roads, but accomplished in remarkably good time. Dorothy, white-faced and trembling but admirably controlled, had the Colonel carried up to his bed and sat beside him, holding his hand, while Margaret hovered in the doorway, uncertain whether her presence was a comfort or an intrusion, and Charles paced the hall below with an expression of grave and evident concern that Miss Marple, watching from the stairs, found herself studying with rather more attention than the situation, on its face, seemed to warrant. Dr. Fenwick, when he arrived, was brisk and thorough. The Colonel, he pronounced after a lengthy examination, had suffered what appeared to be a severe gastric attack of some kind. His pulse was weak, his colour poor, and there were symptoms that troubled the doctor rather more than he was willing to say plainly in front of the family, though Miss Marple, listening at the edge of the room with the particular invisibility that elderly ladies seem to acquire in moments of crisis, caught enough of his murmured consultation with Dorothy to understand that he was not entirely satisfied with a simple explanation of rich food and Christmas excess. "Has he complained of any pain, Mrs. Ashworth?" "Cramping, particularly in the hours before this morning. He said his stomach was troubling him a little last night. After supper, I thought nothing of it. He had eaten rather more of the goose than was good for him, I'm afraid, and there was the plum cake as well. And this morning, before breakfast, did he take anything? Coffee, tea? Only his morning tonic. He has taken it every morning for years, for his digestion. Dr. Mead prescribed it long before your time here, Dr. Fenwick, and it has always agreed with him perfectly well. I should like to see the bottle, if I may." It was at this point that Miss Marple, moving with the unhurried tread of an old lady who has misplaced her spectacles, made her way quietly along the passage toward the Colonel's dressing-room, where his morning tonic was kept upon the washstand in a small brown bottle, alongside his shaving things, and found, to her very great interest, that Charles Ashworth had arrived there before her and was, at the moment she rounded the doorway, in the act of returning the little bottle to its place upon the shelf with a swiftness that suggested he had not expected to be observed. "Mr. Ashworth," she said pleasantly, "I did not know you had any skill in medicine." He turned, and for the second time since his arrival at Ashworth Grange, Miss Marple saw something flicker behind those charming eyes before the smile reasserted itself. "No skill at all, I'm afraid, Miss Marple, only concern. I thought I might bring the tonic down to Dr. Fenwick myself, to save the servants a journey, in all this confusion." "How very thoughtful of you," said Miss Marple, and watched him carry the bottle away down the passage, and said nothing further, though she noted, with the small, precise attention she brought to such things, that his hand, as he had returned the bottle to the shelf, had trembled very slightly, in a manner quite unlike the steady, unhurried movements she had observed in him at every other moment since his arrival. It was here, she was afterward obliged to admit to herself, with some private chagrin, that she made her first true error in the whole affair, for she did not, at that moment, think to examine the bottle herself before it left her sight, for being still uncertain enough of her own suspicions that she did not like to act upon them so directly, and being, besides, genuinely uncertain whether her interest in the tonic sprang from real evidence or from a prejudice against Charles Ashworth that she had, perhaps, allowed to grow a little too readily in the days since his arrival. It was a small omission, and one that cost, in the end, very little, but it troubled her considerably when she thought of it afterward, for she prided herself, not unreasonably, on a habit of thoroughness that had, on this one occasion, given way to a moment's excessive caution. By early afternoon, the Colonel had rallied somewhat under Dr. Fenwick's care, his colour improving, his breathing easier, though the doctor confessed himself unable to say with certainty what had caused the attack, and recommended rest, a light diet, and careful watching over the following days. "A gastric turn," he told the assembled family, in the drawing-room that evening, with the particular carefulness of a country doctor who does not wish to alarm his patients unduly. Not uncommon, at Christmas, with the richness of the food and the excitement of the season. "I have known stronger men than the Colonel laid low by a good deal less. I should like to see him again tomorrow, and I have left instructions regarding his diet in the meantime. There is no cause, I think, for serious alarm." It was a reassurance that satisfied everyone in the room but one. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her usual chair with her knitting once more in her hands, thought privately that Dr. Fenwick's careful, measured words had the particular quality of a man saying rather less than he believed to be true. And she thought, too, of the trembling hand that had returned a small brown bottle to its shelf that morning, and of a signet ring that did not wear its history quite correctly, and of a lake that had never existed at Ashworth Grange. She thought, above all, of the Colonel's announcement 2 evenings before, made with a glass of port in his unsteady hand. "I've spoken to Petford already about amending the will, and it'll be done before the new year." The will had not yet been amended. The Colonel had been taken suddenly and mysteriously ill on the very morning he had intended to set that amendment properly in motion. It might, of course, be nothing more than coincidence, compounded by rich food and a season of excess, exactly as Dr. Fenwick had suggested. Miss Marple was far too experienced a student of human nature to leap to conclusions merely because a coincidence was convenient to her suspicions. But she was equally far too experienced to ignore one. That night, for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth Grange, Miss Marple wrote a short letter, addressed not to any member of the household, but to an old acquaintance in London, whose professional opinion she had found occasion to value on more than one occasion in the past, and gave instructions to the housemaid that it should be posted first thing in the morning by the earliest possible collection. She did not mention to anyone what the letter contained, or to whom, precisely, it had been sent. Threads in the wool. The days that followed the Colonel's illness settled into an uneasy quiet. He improved steadily under Dr. Fenwick's care, well enough by the 29th to sit up in bed and receive visitors, though Dorothy fussed over him with a watchfulness that had not existed before. And the household at large seemed to hold itself a little more carefully than it had before Boxing Day, as though everyone sensed, without quite being able to say why, that something beneath the surface of their comfortable Christmas had shifted. Miss Marple, for her part, had taken up what she privately termed her investigations, though she would have been the first to laugh at so grand a word for what amounted, in practice, to a great deal of quiet observation, a number of carefully unremarkable conversations, and rather more time spent with old copies of the Parish Register and the County Gazetteer than any of her fellow guests would have thought an old lady's holiday required. Her first call was upon Miss Prynne, whom she found, as she had expected, delighted at the prospect of a long gossiping visit over tea. "You will remember, I am sure," Miss Marple said, once the tea had been poured and the initial pleasantries exchanged, "a great deal about the Ashworth family history. You have lived in the parish so very much longer than I have known them. 51 years, Miss Marple, come next April," said Miss Prynne, with evident satisfaction. "I remember Thomas Ashworth as a boy, if that is what you are asking. A wild sort of young man, always into scrapes, though charming with it, very like this new nephew of his, now I think on it, though I dare say that is only natural, blood telling as it does. Did you ever hear, in later years, anything of his life in Africa, whether he married, for instance, or where, precisely, he settled?" "Very little, and what little there was came third or fourth hand, you understand, through people who had known him out there. There was talk, once, some 15 years back or more, that he had died. Of fever, I believe it was, though nobody in the family seemed to have had it confirmed in any proper way. It caused a good deal of sadness at the time, though Thomas had been gone so long by then that it was rather sadness for what was lost long before, if you take my meaning, rather than fresh grief. And no word in all that time of a son." "None that I ever heard," said Miss Prynne, "though that signifies very little, I suppose, given how little was heard of Thomas himself in his later years. Why do you ask, Miss Marple? You have a look about you. I am an old woman, with very little to occupy her mind at Christmas, beyond the family history of her hostess," said Miss Marple placidly, and turned the conversation, with practised skill, toward the subject of Miss Prynne's own Christmas goose, which had apparently proved a great disappointment, being rather tougher than the butcher had promised. It was 2 days later, on the 31st of December, that the reply to Miss Marple's letter arrived. A brief note, in a strong, familiar hand, which she read alone in her room before breakfast, with an expression that, had anyone been present to observe it, would have told them a very great deal indeed. "My dear Miss Marple," it read, "your letter reached me yesterday, and I confess it intrigued me enough that I made some inquiries at once, through a colleague still at the Yard. There is no record of a marriage or birth registered to any Thomas Ashworth in the natal colonial registers for the period you describe, though the records from that period and region are notoriously incomplete, so this proves less than it might. More interestingly, a Thomas Ashworth of approximately the description you give did indeed die of fever at Durban in 1931, quite alone, with no wife or children recorded among his effects, which were modest and included no signet ring of the kind you describe. I should be very glad to hear more of what has prompted these questions, and remain, as ever, most sincerely yours, Henry Clithering." Miss Marple sat for some time with the letter in her lap, her expression graver than her usual mild good humour, for the confirmation of her suspicions brought her, as it so often did, no pleasure at all, only the sober weight of what must now be done with them. It was that same afternoon, walking alone in the frost-hardened garden to clear her thoughts before deciding how best to proceed, that she came upon Charles Ashworth near the old rose garden, standing beside the ornamental pond he had once, in his very first evening at the house, mistakenly called a lake, standing very still, his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets, his handsome face for once entirely without its practised charm, wearing instead an expression of such raw, unguarded strain that Miss Marple, coming upon him unexpectedly, nearly turned back rather than intrude upon it. But it was too late. He had seen her, Miss Marple. His voice, when he spoke, had lost something of its easy warmth. You find me, in poor company, my own thoughts. They do not seem to be pleasant ones, Mr. Ashworth. He was silent for a long moment, looking out over the frozen pond, and when he spoke again, there was something almost defiant in his tone, as though he were arguing with a version of himself rather than with her. Do you know, Miss Marple, I think you have suspected me of something since the very first evening. I have felt it, the way you watch. You are the only one in this house who has not simply accepted me. Miss Marple considered this for a moment and decided, with the particular courage that had served her well over a great many years, that the moment for careful evasion had passed. I think, Mr. Ashworth, she said quietly, that you are not who you have claimed to be. I do not yet know precisely who you are, or precisely why you have done what you have done, but I do not believe you are Thomas Ashworth's son, and I do not believe the ring on your hand has ever belonged to this family until very recently, however skillfully it has been made to look otherwise. She had expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected. Anger, perhaps, or a fresh performance of wounded innocence. What she had not expected was the sudden, terrible stillness that came over him, nor the way his shoulders, after a long moment, seemed to sink, very slightly, as though some weight he had been carrying for weeks had at last grown too heavy to bear a moment longer. I did not poison him, he said, very low. Whatever else you believe of me, I want you to know that. I did not touch that tonic. I only wanted to see the bottle, that morning, because I was afraid of exactly this conversation, afraid someone would think exactly what you are thinking now. I panicked, and I picked it up, and I have never regretted a single foolish action so much in my whole life, because it has made me look guilty of the one thing I did not do. Then perhaps, Mr. Ashworth, said Miss Marple gently, though her eyes remained sharp and watchful upon his face, you had better tell me the truth. All of it, before someone else in this house comes to very much more dangerous conclusions than I have, and before whoever did put something in that tonic bottle has the opportunity to try again. The truth of Charles Ashworth. They walked together, by unspoken agreement, to the small summer house at the far end of the garden. Private enough for the conversation that was to follow, sheltered enough from the bitter afternoon wind that Miss Marple did not think she would regret the walk in her joints the next morning, though she rather suspected she would regret it a little regardless. My name, Charles said, once they were seated, staring out at the frozen garden rather than at her, is not Charles Ashworth. It is Charles Ware. I was born in Durban, it is true, that much of my story was always honest, but my father was not Thomas Ashworth. My father worked for Thomas Ashworth for the better part of 15 years as his clerk and, toward the end, very nearly his only friend, for Thomas died as he had lived the last years of his life, quite alone and quite forgotten by the family he had left behind. I see, said Miss Marple, who had in fact half suspected some arrangement of exactly this kind, though she had not been certain of its precise shape until this moment. Go on, Mr. Ware. My father nursed him in the end. The fever took him slowly, over some weeks, and in that time Thomas talked a very great deal, as dying men will, about the house he had left and the brother he had quarrelled with, and regretted it, every year, more than he ever admitted to a living soul. He talked so much, and in such detail, that my father, who had, I must tell you, fallen upon very hard times himself, and had a family to provide for, and precious little honest prospect of doing so, began to see in Thomas's stories the shape of an opportunity. Charles's mouth twisted, not quite into a smile. He did not act upon it himself. He was, I think, too honest a man for that, whatever his troubles. But he told the stories to me, over the years, as I grew, told them so often and so vividly that I sometimes think I remember Ashworth Grange better than I remember our own house in Durban. And when my father died 2 years ago and left me with nothing but debts and those stories, I am afraid I was not so honest a man as he had been." "You determined to claim Thomas's place in the family," said Miss Marple. "I determined to claim what I told myself was owed to me, for services my father had rendered a dying man that his own family had never troubled themselves to render. All those years he lay ill and lonely in a country not his own. I told myself a great many comfortable things, Miss Marple, in the weeks before I wrote that first letter to Colonel Ashworth. I do not think, now, that any of them were true. I think I simply wanted, very badly, not to be poor and forgotten, as my father had been." "The ring?" "Thomas gave it to my father, in the last week of his life, as thanks for his care. It was, I believe, the only thing of value he had left by then. I had it altered, very slightly, and told myself it was no great crime to wear it, since it had, after all, been given freely, by the last living Ashworth, who had any right to give it." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, turning this confession over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to a difficult pattern in her knitting. "It is a very great deal of dishonesty, Mr. Ware, however sympathetically you dress it. You have deceived a grieving old man into believing his brother's son has been restored to him. You have very nearly persuaded him to alter his will in your favor, at the direct expense of his own daughter. That is not a small matter, whatever wrongs you believe were done to your father." "I know it," Charles said, and there was real anguish in his voice now, the practiced charm entirely stripped away. "I have known it more with every day I have spent in this house, watching them, watching Margaret, particularly, who has done nothing whatever to deserve what I have brought upon her. I had meant, when I began this, to think of it as no more than a kind of debt collected. I had not reckoned on the Colonel being so very kind to me. I had not reckoned on beginning, God help me, to feel something almost like real affection for people I set out only to deceive." He passed a hand over his face. "I had already begun to think I could not go through with it, that I would find some way to withdraw before the will was actually changed, to disappear as quietly as I had come, and let them remember Thomas's son as a pleasant but brief visitor rather than press my claim any further. And then the Colonel fell ill, on the very morning he meant to see Petford, and I understood at once how it must look, and I confess, Miss Marple, I have been half out of my mind with fear ever since, not of discovery, but of being blamed for something very much worse than the lie I actually told." "You believe, then, that someone else in this house administered whatever caused the Colonel's illness? I do not see who else it could be, and I think—" He hesitated, then went on, low and urgent. "I think, Miss Marple, that if it is true, then I am the one who is truly in danger now. For whoever did it meant, surely, to prevent that will from being altered, and if the Colonel recovers fully, and still means to carry out his intention, they will not have accomplished what they set out to do. They will try again, and when it is discovered, as it must be eventually, that I am not who I claim to be, I shall make a very convenient villain indeed, for whoever the real one turns out to be." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment with her mild, faded blue eyes, in which there was, none the less, a very great deal of shrewd and careful calculation. "I think you may be quite right, Mr. Ware," she said at last, "which means we have very little time indeed. I must ask you a number of questions, and I must ask that you answer them with rather more honesty than you have shown this family since your arrival. For I begin to believe that the truth of your own deception, unpleasant as it is, may be the very thing that helps us uncover a deception a great deal more dangerous than yours." "Ask me anything," Charles said. "I have nothing left to lose by honesty now, I think, except whatever small chance remains that this family might one day forgive me." "Very well." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, and her voice, when she continued, had taken on the brisk, precise quality it acquired only rarely. The quality, though Charles could not have known it, that had solved a very great many mysteries, a good deal more serious than the affairs of St. Mary Mead. "Tell me exactly what you observed, the morning the Colonel was taken ill, everyone you saw, in what order, and precisely what each of them was doing, from the moment you rose until the moment Dorothy found him at his desk. Leave out nothing, however small it may seem to you. I have found, in my experience, that it is very often the smallest things that matter most of all." And as the short winter afternoon began to fade toward an early dusk, Charles Ware, no longer Charles Ashworth, and not yet quite certain what he was to become instead, began, haltingly at first, and then with increasing care, to recall for Miss Marple every detail he could summon of that fateful morning, while she listened, her needles for once entirely forgotten, piecing together in her mind a pattern that was, at last, very nearly complete. What the snow revealed. Miss Marple asked for the whole family to be gathered in the drawing-room on New Year's Eve, an hour before dinner. A request unusual enough, coming from a quiet elderly guest, that it produced a good deal of curious speculation among the servants, and no little anxiety among those who had reason to feel it. The Colonel, well enough now to sit up in a chair by the fire with a rug over his knees, presided over the gathering with Dorothy beside him, her hand resting protectively upon his shoulder. Margaret sat a little apart, pale and tense, having been told only that Miss Marple wished to speak to the family about a matter of some importance. Peter Ashworth lounged near the window with his usual easy confidence, though Miss Marple, watching him closely as the room settled, thought she detected beneath that confidence something rather more watchful than his manner generally allowed to show. Miss Prynne had been invited also, at Miss Marple's particular request, along with Mr. Hartley the vicar, for Miss Marple had found, over a long life, that the truth was very often better received in the presence of those the family trusted and respected, rather than delivered in private, where it might too easily be doubted or dismissed. Charles stood near the fireplace, his face pale but composed, having agreed, indeed having asked, to face what was coming rather than flee it, which Miss Marple privately thought spoke rather better of him than anything else he had done since his arrival. "I am afraid," Miss Marple began, when the room had quieted, her knitting for once entirely set aside in her lap, "that I must tell you all something rather unpleasant, though I hope, before I am finished, that some good may yet come of it. Colonel Ashworth, my dear, the young man you have welcomed into your family as your nephew Charles is not, in fact, the son of your brother Thomas." The silence that followed this announcement had a quality Miss Marple had encountered many times before, the particular stillness of a room absorbing a shock too large to process all at once. The Colonel's ruddy face had gone quite grey. Dorothy's hand tightened upon his shoulder. Margaret made a small, sharp sound that was not quite a gasp. "His name," Miss Marple continued gently, "is Charles Ware. His father was in service to your brother Thomas in his last years in Africa, and cared for him faithfully as he died. It was from those years of devoted service, and from the stories your brother told in his final illness, that this young man learned everything he later used to construct his claim upon this family. It was wrong of him to do so, very wrong, and he does not, I think, ask you to forgive him easily for it. But I would ask you to remember, before you judge him too harshly, that he came to this house intending a deception, and found instead that he could not, in the end, complete it. That the kindness shown to him by this family made the lie harder to bear with every day that passed, not easier." "Is this true?" the Colonel asked, his voice thick, turning to Charles directly, for the first time. "Every word of it, sir," Charles said quietly. "I have no excuse to offer you that would not sound like exactly what it is, an excuse. I am more sorry than I know how to say." There was a long, difficult silence, broken at last, unexpectedly, by Margaret, who rose from her chair and crossed the room to stand before him. "Was any of it true?" she asked. "The things you told us about your father, about what Thomas said of us, at the end?" "All of that was true," Charles said. "That much, at least, I never lied about. Your uncle loved this house until the day he died, and regretted the quarrel every year he was away from it. I only lied about who I was to you." Miss Marple allowed this small human moment its space before continuing, for she judged, correctly as it happened, that the family would need to sit with this first revelation before they were ready to hear the second, which was very much graver. "There is more, I am afraid," she said at last, "and this part concerns something a great deal more serious than a false name. Colonel Ashworth, I do not believe your illness on Boxing Day was a gastric attack brought on by rich food, as Dr. Fenwick was kind enough to suggest, to spare us undue alarm. I believe your morning tonic was tampered with by someone in this house on the very morning you intended to instruct Mr. Petford to alter your will." "Good God," the Colonel said faintly. "I wrote, some days ago, to an old friend with considerable experience in these matters," Miss Marple went on, "and asked him to have the remaining contents of that tonic bottle examined, through Dr. Fenwick's cooperation. I received his reply only this morning. The tonic had been adulterated with a quantity of foxglove. Enough, Dr. Fenwick assures me, to produce exactly the symptoms you suffered, and enough, had a second and larger dose followed, to have done a very great deal worse." Dorothy had gone quite white. "But who, Jane, who could possibly have done such a thing?" "That," said Miss Marple, "was the question I found hardest to answer, for a considerable time. I suspected, I confess, at various points, nearly everyone in this house, including, for rather too long, Mr. Ware himself, who had, after all, the clearest motive of anyone, in wishing to prevent that will from being amended before he had secured his place in it. But Mr. Ware convinced me, and I now believe entirely, that he did not do this thing. For a man clever enough to construct so elaborate and patient a deception as his would hardly have chosen so clumsy and dangerous a method to protect it, when simple patience would have served him a great deal better and a great deal more safely." "Then who?" Margaret asked. "I found myself thinking," Miss Marple said, "of a very similar matter that once troubled a family in my own village. Old Mr. Sanders and his gardener's boy, who dosed his master's medicine not from any wish to see him die, but from a foolish, frightened hope of preventing a change that he believed would ruin someone he loved. It is a very human sort of crime, when it comes down to it, not born of greed exactly, but of fear, and of love that has curdled into something desperate. And so I asked myself, who in this house stood to lose the most and to gain the least from Colonel Ashworth's will being altered in Charles's favour? And who among you had both the opportunity and the particular knowledge required to know precisely when that alteration was about to become irreversible?" Her gaze moved, slowly and without malice, to the window, where Peter Ashworth stood very still, his easy, careless manner gone entirely from his face. "You are Mr. Petford's clerk, Peter," Miss Marple said gently. "You would have known, better than anyone else in this house, exactly what your employer's instructions from the Colonel would mean, and exactly how soon they were to be carried out. You arrived on Christmas Eve in evident distress about your motoring journey, and I confess I thought nothing of it at the time, but I have since learned, from a conversation with Miss Prynne, that your firm has been in some considerable difficulty of late, and that you had hoped, quite reasonably, that Margaret's inheritance, when it came, might in time become your own also, should she consent to marry you, as I understand she has been considering for some months." Margaret turned to look at Peter with an expression of dawning horror. "Peter, I never meant harm to come to him," Peter burst out suddenly, all pretense collapsing at once, his voice cracking with a wretchedness that seemed, in that moment, entirely genuine. "I swear it, Margaret. I meant only to delay it, to make him too ill to see Petford for a week or two, long enough for me to find some way to make Charles's claim look doubtful, to buy time to prove what I already half suspected about him. I never meant to give him enough to truly harm him. I measured it so carefully, I promise you I did." "You measured poison for a sick old man, Peter," Margaret said, very quietly, as though that were a small thing merely because you were careful about the quantity. The room had fallen into a silence very different from the one that had greeted the revelation of Charles's identity. colder and sadder, for there was no story here of a family's stolen joy being restored, only the plain, unhappy fact of a young man's desperation curdling into something he could not now undo. It was Dr. Fenwick, sent for at Miss Marple's quiet request before the gathering began, who came to lead Peter away not many minutes later, the matter now properly one for the police rather than for the family drawing-room, and it was a subdued and shaken household that sat down, rather later than planned, to a New Year's Eve dinner that none of them, that year, had very much heart for. And yet, in the days that followed, something gentler began, slowly, to take root among the wreckage of that difficult Christmas. Colonel Ashworth, once his initial shock and anger had passed, found himself unable to entirely regret the fortnight he had spent believing his brother's son restored to him, for the affection, however wrongly founded, had been real enough on both sides, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not wish to lose it now that its foundation had been explained, if not excused. Charles Ware, no relation, but no longer quite a stranger either, remained at Ashworth Grange rather longer than he had originally intended, working, at the Colonel's own insistence, to make what amends he could. And it was Margaret, of all people, who argued most fiercely on his behalf, when Dorothy wondered aloud whether he ought not simply be sent away. "He lied to us," she said, "and I will not pretend that does not matter. But he told us the truth the moment it mattered most, and he did not have to. I think there is a difference, in the end, between a man who deceives and disappears, and a man who deceives and stays to make it right." Miss Marple, hearing this from her chair by the fire, her knitting once more busy in her hands, thought privately that Margaret had put the matter a good deal better than she herself could have done, and reflected, as the old year drew quietly to its close, that Christmas, for all its stolen moments and its uncovered lies, had a curious way of mending what it broke, given only a little patience and a little courage and someone willing to sit quietly enough and watch closely enough to let the truth find its own way home.